Last week, we made quite a bit of movement through Matthew, talking about the Olivet Discourse, and we got to the to talking about the signs of the things to come, and we talked about those cataclysmic events. The sun and the moon will stop shining, all those kind of things. And then today we're going to get to verse 32. We'll talk about verse 32 and 35, and this is a little bit more around the timing of the event. Now, I've told you guys that I'm working on an updated chart of the timeline of all the things that we've done. And the reason I want to do it a little bit different is because there's going to be some things that we have to fill out in there as we go, especially when we start getting into Revelation. And we just need to make sure we understand what we think we understand, make sure we understand the timing and that sort of thing. Now, a lot of these things that we'll talk about, you guys have already seen. We know of the event and we know that it's supposed to happen in the future. But what we don't know is when exactly. And there's some of these things that we read, and I was talking to Jane, I think, last week. We were talking about some of these events. And when you read it, reading the narrative of something happening, it makes it seem like this happens, and then you wait a minute, and then this happens, and then you wait a minute, and this happens. But when you're trying to describe what happened, you're putting together these events that all happened at once. So there's these things that, just immediately go after each other. In milliseconds, they happen sometimes. But when you try to explain it, your story will last longer than the event did because it just happened that quickly. And there's some things that I think as we go through this, that there's some things that will happen and will happen very quickly in succession. There's several things that'll happen that, you read about, and you may go back later and go, well, that did, and that did, and that did, but wow, I didn't expect them all to be right there. And there's going to be some of those that I think will happen that way, that we'll have to be wary of when we're reading it, that we're not waiting for one sign, we see it, and then we wait for a while and something else happens. There's some that the sign is going to be about the same time as the event. And just keep that in mind as you go, that in narrative form of writing it, sometimes it kind of misrepresents the timing of what actually will occur at the speed of. And that's something that I struggle with when I'm reading scripture. If I'm reading any of it, there's some things that, will be condensed into a paragraph or so. You talk about Paul, when Paul had the scales removed and he went to Arabia for a while. And then it said, and then I went to Jerusalem. And I mean, it literally is this much of a paragraph. Well, it was 3 years, but then it was 14 years before he went back to Jerusalem. So in total, it was nearly 20 years. But it seems like it was an immediate thing that happened. And that's what we have to keep in mind as we're studying, is sometimes the form of the narrative doesn't really tell all of what was there and what happened. John said it in his gospel that, here's an account of the things that I needed to write down, but there was so much more that I left out. And all the books in the world, the whole world couldn't hold everything that was there. So just as you go, keep in mind there's things in a narrative that you don't tell, that are not there, that the timing is a little off, just to help you understand sometimes how this goes. So let's get to verse 32 and 35, where Jesus speaks more regarding the timing of end events. And he says, learn this parable from a fig tree. And one of the things that you'll see from here through the end of this chapter and through most of the next, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the parables that he taught, and he told them at that point. And you're probably going to go, okay, but I thought we were doing end time. And we get to that. There's several places that I've said that where I go, I thought we were doing end time. but there's some very important messages in some of these that don't directly relate to the end time events, but are very relevant in the overall terms of end times and what you should be prepared for. Learn this parable from the fig tree. The fig tree has a regular pattern. The leaves appear, and then summer follows. And when you see the leaves, you know summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. So Jesus assured them that when these signs appear, they're going to know it. You know what happens after this. You know what happens after that. As the fig tree blooms, as the leaves come out, you know what's going to happen, right? And so Jesus is kind of telling them here, be assured that when these signs appeared, as he foretold, and he's talking about the abomination of desolation, followed by the great tribulation, followed by the signs in the heavens, his return to the earth would follow. When a fig tree buds, there's an inevitable result. Unless something cataclysmic happens when the fig tree or any other fruit tree buds, what happens? Leaves come out, and then eventually you have fruit on those trees, right? And you know that. That's a natural occurrence of what happens. And Jesus is trying to tell them here, as sure as you see those kind of things, know that what I'm telling you about those events are going to happen. Really, it was just as Daniel prophesied in Daniel 12:11 that he was talking about. The end will come 1,290 days after the abomination of desolation. Jesus assures that the agonies of the Great Tribulation will not continue indefinitely. They will have an end. Now, up to this point, Jesus has given an important outline for end time events. There will arise catastrophes and persecutions, but those themselves are not really the signs of the end or the sign of the end. There will arise a pivotal sign, the abomination of desolation. That's the one sign that when that happens, you know it's about to really go haywire. Things are going to go out of control, we think. They're all in his control, but it's going to be chaos and things happen like we've not seen when this happens. So on the heels of the abomination of desolation comes great tribulation and cosmic disturbances. And then in the culmination of all that, Jesus will return in glory to the earth. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. And this statement of Jesus is one of the central reasons many have looked for all or most of the events of this chapter to be fulfilled in AD 70. They want to say that it all happened there, that we can see it coming. We know he's on the way here. We're going to get into some of those. I've told you guys about what's coming here shortly, where we're going to look at the secret decoder ring of the different views and how they work in here for people to understand it the way they do. Because you'll probably see my slant as I teach, because that's where I think it goes. But I try to be as fair as I can to the other views and present them. But there's some that are just so different that I can't effectively tell you all of them without us being here forever. So I'm trying to balance it between the two so that you can make up your mind as to what you believe the gospel says. Don't believe what I say. Just believe what you read and what you study. Hopefully what I tell you helps, but don't believe it just because I say it or anybody else does. So approximately 40 years after Jesus spoke the words here, that would have been AD 70, but yet as previously argued, to assert this is to greatly stretch the most natural interpretation of the abomination of desolation, of the severity of the Great Tribulation, and of the cosmic signs. We talked about it in particular. We've talked about the abomination of desolation and then the Great Tribulation. Such has never been seen. And we talked about some instances where people want to look at that and say, well, that all happened during AD 70 when they destroyed Rome and broke down the temple. Is that kind of thing that is great tribulation that we have never seen. No, it was bad, but I wouldn't say it's the greatest that's ever been seen or ever will be seen. So you start getting into a point where if you try to make the facts fit certain historic facts, they just don't work out too well. So of the severity of the Great Tribulation, the cosmic signs, and the coming of the Son of Man, we can talk about the cosmic signs. We mentioned that a little bit before about the different moon phases and the eclipses that have happened all throughout history. And you try to point to them. There's some that point to some specific things that happen with eclipses, solar and lunar, in and around AD 70 and the destruction of the temple, and try to point to it. But it's hard, again, to go back and say that's exactly what Jesus meant there, because it really doesn't fit the severity of what he's talking about in time. It's better to let those passages have their most natural meaning and to fit this promise into that framework instead of trying to fit it into some other framework. The generation Jesus meant cannot be the generation of the disciples, because they never saw Jesus return in glory, as he says he will do. Matthew 24:30. It's undoubtedly the generation that actually sees the signs that he's talking about. These events and Jesus's return won't be in some 1,000-year timetable or 2,000 year. We can't put a timetable on when it will happen, because we certainly don't know. The disciples thought it was going to happen in their lifetime. It didn't. We're nearly 2,000 years later, and it still hasn't. And we see things happening that we think is hastening the end, and they are. Every day gets closer and closer. But this world and us, well, not us, we won't make it, but this earth in its form now could be here another 1,000 years, another 2,000 years. We don't know. And that's what they're trying to point out when they do this study here, is there's no definitive timetable. And if you try to put it on there, you're going to just start messing with what it literally easily says will happen. Just wait for it. It's been suggested that the word generation could also be translated as race. It's a promise that the Jewish race would not be extinguished and would survive to the end. This would be a valuable promise, but some commentators claim that this is an embarrassingly wrong translation. Yet others, such as Adam Clarke, who strongly believe the events of the chapter were almost all fulfilled in AD 70. And you'll hear me quote Adam Clarke a lot, because there's a lot he says that I agree with. I don't agree with him on that point, where he says the things were fulfilled in AD 70. This race, he says, the Jews shall not cease from being a distinct people till all the counsels of God relative to them and the Gentiles are fulfilled. So even he says that can't be what it means, because all of the other things have to be fulfilled that pertain to the Jews and to the Gentiles. In verse 36, there is more on his coming, but from a little bit different approach. Jesus says that the day and the hour of his return is unknowable by men and even unknowable by angels. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Of that day and hour, no one knows. Here, Jesus refers back to the original question of Matthew 24:3, where he was asked, what will be a sign of your coming? And his answer is somewhat unexpected to them, because they thought he was going to say February 23rd AD. He didn't. He said, of that day and hour, no one knows. So, the disciples, I try to take the approach that if I was walking with Jesus in that day and he said some of these things, how would I react to it? And I'd be, you claim to be God and you're telling me that you're going to come back, but you don't know when. I mean, those are some of the things that I think in my sinful mind I would be asking. You told me that, but you don't know when.
Well, just just like us, they had a jaded view because they were being persecuted by the Romans, and they wanted to be delivered from that and be a great kingdom. Like in the back of their minds, they were thinking of that present trauma they were experiencing.
Well, when he came, they thought he was going to come riding in on a horse and overtake everything anyway. So everything is kind of confusing. So when you get to that and you start thinking about some of the things, I can see where they were confused. A lot of people, and I used to do this too, I would say, they were right there with him. How could they not? But they were like us. I mean, they didn't know either.
Well,
They were fishing one day and then walking with him the next, right?
well, and too, for those people, it was probably the worst they had ever seen.
Yeah. And that's for, if you go back and do some studies of Colossae and the area around that time, Corinth, there were some things that are recorded in history that we don't see in the Bible. That was a wicked, vile, terrible place.
And just think about Rome when Nero was the emperor.
Yeah, and the things that were happening, like from a sexual promiscuity nature, we think it's bad now. It's not. It was terrible back then. So, we see things that are relative to what we see, and we think it's bad, and it is bad. I'm not saying it's not bad, but there are things that happened in Corinth during that time that were even worse than what we see. So we have to try to take that into perspective and say, as we go forward, yeah, things are bad. We see some really bad things, but they're really not any worse in a lot of cases than what they've been at multiple times through history in different areas and regions and under different
We
rulers.
just hear about it quick.
Yeah, we just hear about it quicker primarily.
They had a town down the road 20 miles and not ever knowing what happened.
Yeah, exactly. So to give this idea the strongest emphasis, Jesus claimed that this knowledge was reserved for his Father only. If Jesus himself, at least during his earthly ministry, did not know this day and hour, it emphasizes the foolishness of any person making certain predictions regarding the prophecy of his coming. And I think that is something that we have to really pay attention to, because you guys have all seen at least one that says they know when. You've seen at least one. And I bet you could hold up both hands and say you've probably seen at least that many that say they know when he's coming. And Jesus was emphatically telling them, no one knows but the Father. If Jesus didn't know it, like say, at least on his earthly mission, why do you think any of us would know it? We wouldn't know it. So no one knows. Based on what he had told us about the abomination of desolation, we might have expected that the exact day and hour could be known. After all, Daniel set the days of Jesus's return as being exactly 1,290 days after the abomination of desolation. Now, once we see that and we know that that's the clock starts ticking, and we can say, bam, right? That's something that we kind of know. That's something that we may know. But there's a dilemma here. How can the day of Jesus's coming be both completely unknown and at the same time be known according to Daniel? Okay, that's one of the things that people will point to. Well, in verses 37, 39, Jesus says that his coming will be when the world is as it was in the days of Noah. Mark nor Luke really include this passage about Noah. This was something that Matthew, a Jew, would know. He would know a lot about Noah. But he wasn't really talking about Noah in the sense that he was talking about the things that happened to Noah are definitive signs of when the end comes. He's talking about how when Noah was there and the things around him were going on, what were people doing?
Buying and selling.
They were buying and selling and marrying and eating and drinking and just living their life, right? And that's what he was saying is here is it's going to be just like that. All of a sudden, it's going to start raining.
But But don't you think that speaks to what you're saying? With Noah, it took him like 100 years to build that ark.
Mhm.
So for 100 years, people were looking at him building this boat and thinking he was crazy because it had
Yeah.
not rained.
Yeah.
So that speaks to what we're talking about. That you hear people say, "Oh, it's coming, it's coming,"
Yeah.
but it could be.
Yeah, it could be a long way off. And there are definitive signs that you see. But when we talk about labor pains and we talk about cosmically, if you try to relate labor pains, I don't personally know about labor pains. I've seen it happen a time or two, right? I've seen it happen. And I know that typically it's not one of those things that you go, oh, and you have a baby. I mean, not typically. It lasts for a while and you see it going and it progressively gets worse and worse. And people understand that in their personal basis, right? That they've seen that happen. In those days, you didn't go to a hospital, you were at the house. So they knew what labor looked like. They had seen it. They knew it was not something that was easy and just all of a sudden one day, boop, there's a baby. It's something that takes a while. And that's where he uses this analogy in the labor pains. He didn't mean it's going to last 9 months of difficulties. He talks about how it's going to go on and it's going to get worse and then finally give birth to that event, right? That's what we're talking about. But as with Noah, it says that in the days of Noah, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. F.F. Bruce said some charge these with sinister meaning. Eating, hinting at gluttony, because often used as beast, though also in the sense of eating of men. Marrying and giving in marriage. And he said euphemistically pointing at sexual licenses on both sides. Yet he comes to the conclusion here, he said, the idea rather seems to be that all things went on as usual, as if nothing were going to happen. So it's not like we're looking at these things and we're all sitting on our edge going, okay, is he coming today? And not get anything done in our life, not eat, not drink, not marry, not get married. He's wanting to make sure that they live their life. They continue doing what they're supposed to do it in service to him. But the focus was not on sitting around waiting on signs and only sitting around and waiting on signs. And there's some people who do that. They live for that. They try to find them. Jesus was telling them specifically not to do that. We should also remember, though, that those days of Noah were marked by violence and demonic oppression. There were a lot of things going on in that day. And did not know until the flood came and took them all away. Those in the day of Noah were warned. They had been given warning that judgment would come, and it eventually came. To those who had ignored the warnings, it came suddenly and unexpectedly. How many of y'all have seen after a tornado hits, you invariably interview somebody in the trailer park with no teeth that says that says they didn't warn us at all. It just came out of nowhere. I've been watching James Spann for 4 hours. It was not without warning. There was warning. And that's the thing about it. If you're not watching that, or if you're not paying attention to that warning, you will think it just came out of nowhere. Just bam. I didn't know it was raining or anything. And then we're upside down in the trailer park.
Jeff
And-
Foxworthy did a thing on that.
It's just one. It really aggravates me. It gets aggravated at me because I get so aggravated at some of this stuff where they'll say it came without warning. It's like, no, it didn't. They've been telling you.
Without warning, when I spent 12 hours on the Highway 280 trying to get home, and that snow.
Now that did come without warning to a degree, but I mean there were things that came and there were signs of it that came, and that's what he's saying here is if you don't listen to the warnings, if you don't obey what I'm telling you, if you just ignore it, it's going to seem like it comes out of nowhere. Nobody told me. Well, you did. You just didn't listen.
Kind of like the guy that drowned Sitting on his housetop. there
Yeah.
After he got it, sent out.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, Lord, save me, Lord. And along comes a boat. And he says, sir, jump in the boat. Nope, the Lord's going to save me. Okay. And then all of a sudden, here comes a helicopter flying in and says, sir, grab the rope, get in the helicopter. And he says, nope, the Lord's going to save me. And then the floods overtake him and he winds up in heaven. He says, Lord, why didn't you save me? He said, I sent a boat and I sent a helicopter. What were you doing? Yeah. Yeah, it is one of those things where we see that they're there, but we don't pay attention to them a lot. And that's what Jesus is trying to tell them. Don't worry about what's going to happen then right now. Make sure you're doing the right thing now. Make sure you're listening. Make sure you're doing what I've commanded. D.A. Carson said that the coming of the Son of Man takes place at an unknown time can only be true if, in fact, life seems to be going on pretty much as usual, just as in the days before the flood. So if we get to a point where we have these signs that are coming and everybody's like, oh, that's it. Here it comes. Here it comes. It's not really unexpected, right? And that's another point that he's trying to make is as this goes on, it will seem normal up until it happens. So in this, there is that dilemma that we talked about of how he can come to a business as usual world and a world that experiences the worst calamities ever seen. And this is where we start talking about one of those things that you read this and it seems like this long time, but you can get these signs and then all these terrible things happen. All of that is unexpected. It's very quick. You'll notice them all. But if you've been in an accident or if you've been in certain things, how many times have you been? I remember this past summer when I fell on the boat. In the short time that it just took me to fall, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not going to have any teeth. I'm going to be unconscious in the water. I'm going to die right here in that split second as I fell. I mean, so all of these things you'll recognize later when it happens, you'll go, wow, the sun and moon did stop shining. And this, all these things happen, but they may have happened quick. So if we look at that in verses 40 to 44, Jesus cautions his disciples to be ready for that unexpected coming. Then 2 men will be left in the field. One will be taken and the other left. Jesus here is pointed to curious disappearances, and those who believe in the rapture will point to this and say this points to the rapture and that happens, the disappearances, the catching away of the Son of Man. They'll point to 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, and we'll talk about that later when we get there. Taken is the same verb used in 1:20. 17 and 1, 18, 16, and 2017 of 1 Thessalonians. It applies to take someone to be with you, and therefore here points to the salvation rather than the destruction of one taken. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. Since the day and hour of his coming are unknowable, Jesus' followers must be on constant guard. This is the crux of what he's trying to tell you. Don't wait till the last minute. Could you imagine how we would live if we knew that in 100 days he's coming? And we definitively know that. And we know that up to day 99, we have got time to be able to then go, Lord, forgive me of all my sins. I'm sorry. I believe in you. I turn to you. And we live like hell the rest of that time. That's what he's warning them against. Is like, I might come tomorrow. I might come in 1,000 years. Whichever it is, be ready. Be ready for it. We come to a point where we again see some dilemma in the second coming here. Is it at an unexpected hour or is it positively predicted? There are many who make predictions of his second coming, and for years and years, each time, each one of them get it wrong. Is it business as usual or worldwide cataclysm we talked about? We read Revelations, we read of wars and rumors of wars. We read of earthquakes and earth-shattering events. Is it meeting him in the air? 1 Thessalonians 4:16, or is he coming with the saints? Which one is it? There's different views, right? If you studied any of the end time events you talked about, there's different views on which one it means. Is it coming once or twice? There's arguments about that. And in this, there's a lot of controversy. I think sometimes it's too much controversy about something that is not as important as we tend to make it sometimes, but there's a lot of controversy about it. William Barclay said, it is in two sections and they seem to contradict each other. The first, verses 32 and 35, seem to indicate that as a man can tell by the signs of nature when summer is on the way, so he can tell by the signs of the world when the second coming is on the way. The second section, verses 36 to 41, says quite definitively that no one knows the time of the second coming, not the angels, not even Jesus himself, but only God, and that it will come upon men with suddenness of a rainstorm out of a blue sky. So the dilemma is resolved by seeing that there are actually two second comings. And this is one thing that there's going to be a lot of disagreement with some on. You'll find this in a lot of different places. But the two comings is the one that as we read, you'll start seeing people that believe in this. One is in the air for the church, commonly known as the rapture. The other is to the world coming with the church, commonly known as the second coming of Jesus. And the contradictions in Matthew 24 and much of the rest of the prophecy here are often solved by seeing there are really references to two returns. And that's where there's some big controverscy. And we'll see what it is a little bit later.
Is that the one we're talking about where, like, when they take the rapture happens and the people are left? And of course, and basically, they want to see if you take Mark of the Beast and live through hell here on earth. And it's basically, you're almost like segregated just to really fight, just to go to.
Yeah, when we get to, we're about to break into something outside of the passage. We may start next week. I don't remember exactly where it is, where we're going to start about the millennial views. And that's where this starts coming into play, because there's parts that you read that says his second coming. One, if you believe in the rapture, there's two events. One, that he comes in the air, so he doesn't actually come to earth, to the earth, takes away the saved, called the rapture, and then the tribulation, and then he comes back at the end. And those are the views that we have to reconcile ourselves.
I wish it was more clear, though, in the Bible of understanding. I really do.
I know.
Because that opens up a lot of questions and people that, like myself, I don't know the Bible front to back, and people that know you have a little bit of a little bit of that weakness, they'll hit you up and they'll be like, then why is there so many books in the Bible that are missing?
Yeah.
And they'll start with that, and they
Oh, yeah.
like, well, it's not defined by this or that, and it does kind of,
And
a little bit of a.
They'll point to these controversies that we have where people in this room probably have some different views about what we're going to talk about, right? Yeah. And I want us to be careful that we don't get too, at least hostile about it, because, we all have room to interpret. We may get it wrong. We may get it right. We'll have to see. But there's things in there that you can read that you can go, wait a minute. Now, if I'm reading it this way, this is how I read it. And that's what I'm talking about with that secret decoder ring that we talk about. And I keep using that kind of humorously, but there is kind of a way to look at it. If you follow these rules and you do it by this system of interpretation, you're going to come to an amillennial viewpoint of the end times. If you put this on the top of it, you're going to come to a historic premillennial view of what happens, which typically includes some of the things that we're talking about here. But the historic, the longest suffering, I guess you could say, the longest known view of premillennial rule of Jesus or return of Jesus for his people does not include a rapture. If you start looking at the rapture view, that really didn't come into a big prominent view until the 1900s. So, we have to sit there and then look at it and go, okay, well, did we miss it? Did they miss it? Did it not get revealed until a certain time? We have to resolve that some way. I can tell you now, I'm not going to resolve it for you. We can go through all of this and I can tell you what I think, but it's not going to resolve it for you. And that's the difficult part and why so many people don't like teaching on end events.
Maybe that's why Pastor Jared don't want to talk much about
I mean, there's a lot of people who steer clear of it. And they do not because they don't have a belief, not because they don't think there's truths in it, but because typically people get mad when you don't think the way they think. And that's why a lot of people will stay away from it. But I stayed away from it as long as I could. But when I agreed to do it, I agreed only in the way that we have to go all the way through to try to understand how you come to a particular view. And then I still struggle. I still go, am I truly understanding what the Bible says, or am I leaning on tradition that I've been taught for years and years? Because there's parts I read sometimes that go, that doesn't necessarily hook up with exactly what I believe.
Well, there's sometimes too and this is what Joey and I talked about it at home, because I don't think he and I do believe the same way. There's this thing of whether you were taught to believe a certain way, you relied on your pastors, you relied on your former churches, you relied on your older grandfathers or whatever to give you that perception. First of all, rapture word is not in the Bible.
No,
We use it so
I didn't know that.
the word is not. Yeah.
But we use it like it is. But, ask yourself this. Do you want to believe that you go before what we consider the rapture just because you don't want to believe that you're going to suffer the 7 years of tribulation?
Yes.
I mean, I've always said, hey, just get at the end and just make sure you're going to get there, whether it's beginning or end. Just
Then I don't have to worry about it. Yeah.
But for me personally, I don't indulge in pain and hardship, so I will just believe that, we have a rapture and I get to go, and all of you others that wasn't smart enough, guess what? I'll just hit that boat. But you've got to read the Bible and see what it truly says and make that determination yourself. Because what if you believe what I believe and I've led you the wrong way?
But
What
as
if
a
you believe what
teacher-
Joey said? You have to believe what you read.
As a teacher, though, this came up Wednesday night in the ladies' class about predestination. And two of the ladies point blank asked me, what do I think? And I'm up there teaching this and I'm thinking, I'm a novice compared to some of the women in that room, but my comment was we have to look at the nature of God, because we believe God does not change, and look at it from that view instead of me sitting here saying this is how it is, because I don't have all the answers, right?
Yeah.
Just like you're saying, you're not going to necessarily solve all this predicament for us, but you learn the nature of God by studying His Word, and then you can see things more clearly.
Yeah.
So-
Well, I started this week, and there's a lot of things I'm working on. I've been working through some of the book of Revelation, and I thought it might be helpful as you go through. We're going to cover the different views, but then especially when you get to Revelation, it helps to be able to go back and go, wait a minute, what did so-and-so think? And I found a thing in one of the little Holman Bible storybooks to me that has the three primary views. Not it doesn't have post-millennialism because it doesn't really fit in the same way. But the amillennial, the premillennial, and then the premillennial dispensationalists. And I know those are words and we go, huh? We'll talk about those. But it sits there almost on a verse-by-verse basis and says, in this verse, amillennial sees this as being fulfilled in AD 70. Premillennialists feel like this is going to be future. So you've got these different views of if it were fulfilled, when it will be fulfilled, and how it will be fulfilled. And as you go through we're not going to go verse by verse by verse. We're going to do a lot of verses in Revelation. But you'll get to be able to kind of look and go, okay, I see and sometimes you can go, oh, I get that. And I can tell you honestly, in putting this together, in those 3 columns, I can tick boxes in each one of them. I mean, there's certain things that I can go, yeah, I believe that. And I think one of the most detrimental things we can do is we can label believers in labels that make us enemies of each other and enemies of other Christians.
Get ready, wherever you believe.
That's the point to me is I think that is probably the overwhelming from cover to cover that I think is the most important is get ready.
Well, and I'm glad that you're teaching it, even if we may not solve all the answers. I mean, God didn't put it in the book for us not to read it.
No,
When people stay away from it.
he actually said we'd be blessed.
Yes.
The reader will be blessed.
We're not to study it because you don't read any book and not
Yeah.
know what happens in the end. Even if we don't have all the answers,
Yeah.
I think he wants us to read it. And
Yeah.
even if it's difficult, we shouldn't shy away.
Well, we kind of stopped in the middle of that. We'll pick back up next week, but I want to make sure because we are about to really stop out of the scripture that we're in, and we're going to go in a little series. We're going to talk about some of these beliefs and why we focus on them and why there's so much disagreement. And some of these, when you start looking at the views, you'll go, huh? Really? How did you get that? But then they look at us and they go, huh? How did you get that? That's the problem with it is there's a lot of people who don't understand it. And Chris, a word of encouragement. I don't know it all either. I've been reading this stuff. I know, I know a lot of it. I've gone over. I know what it says, but I'm still conflicted on some of it. There's things that I still go, is that really what it says? Is that really what it meant? And I'll read some of the other points and commentaries from other people. And sometimes I go, that's a really good point. I really need to think about it that way. Whether my overall view has changed or not, I don't know that I would say that, but I would say there are definitively pieces inside of my view that I probably don't believe the same as you or you. And everybody can say that. I think everybody would probably say it. And I just want us to all, as we go through, if we have questions, if we run into it. And that's one reason I wanted to stop in the middle of this, because at the end of the passage, the Olivet Discourse that Matthew talks about, he starts talking specifically about end time events, judgment, and those kind of things. And if you look at it with me teaching you from my point of view, the way I think it's supposed to kind of go, then you're going to miss out on some of those other views and why they may or may not be right. And that's why I wanted to break it up into that so we can go through it. I think it'll help. You may come out and go, yeah, okay, I got it. I still believe what I believed when I came in, and that's okay. But at least we can have the opportunity to talk about it and make sure that we truly can make an account of what we believe. Be ready. We can go out and we can try to explain it to the best of our ability and that we know. And I honestly think, like Rick said, like I have continuously said, the purpose of Revelation is not to have us where we sit there and we know every single event and every single step. It's for us to see that we must be ready. I think that's more important than the events, honestly. But some people think the events are more important. Yeah. All right. Thank y'all. Any other comments or questions?
However you think that end times occur, it seems to me as this is my lifetime, that things are accelerating.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I look around and think God must be totally disgusted
Oh, yeah.
the churches in Europe are closed. If you ever go there, they're shut down and they're used to
Yeah.
other things. Our country is being invaded
Mhm.
by non-Christian people. It's like, you know,
Yeah.
things can't go like this forever.
Yeah.
And the most disgusting thing, I guess, to me, is that our country looks at young people and altering their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
I mean, God must just be totally
Yeah.
disgusted.
I agree.
And you know, it to me, it really highlights his long suffering, loving nature because I hate to share a lot of us, but my wife gets really aggravated at me watching TV. Really aggravated because the commercials and some of the things that go on, it just drives me crazy. And if it were up to me, he'd already be back. You know what I'm saying? It would already have taken, but it's not up to me. And it does show his long suffering, patience with us. Because there'll be some who will repent from that, some who won't. And you're right, though, it's progressively getting worse and worse and worse, and it's going to get even worse. So